This video is sponsored by Audible. Start listening with a 30-day free trial that includes 1 audiobook and 2 Audible originals by going to audible.com/companyman or by texting companyman to 500 500. There was a time when baseball was the biggest sport in the US, but that was a while ago now. Today, it's football. Take a look at sales, viewership, surveys, any ranking will place football at a distant first. Most data will tell you that America's transition from baseball to football happened somewhere in the 1960s. This was a crazy time for the sport. Obviously, America's interest in football was at an all-time high, which meant that this was a perfect opportunity for existing leagues to grow and for new leagues to enter the market. As far as existing leagues at the time, virtually the only one was the NFL, same as today. I know, there's different ones that come and go, but in the history of the sport, nothing has truly challenged the dominance of the NFL except for one. I'm talking about the American Football League. They were created in 1959 as a direct competitor with the NFL, looking to capitalize on America's growing interest in football. Lamar Hunt and Bud Adams deserve a lot of credit here. I actually think we can learn something from them because this is one of the ultimate examples of staying determined and finding unconventional ways to succeed. Where there's a will, there's a way is the phrase that comes to mind. Lamar and Bud were already extremely rich, millionaires from the oil business, both with aspirations of owning an NFL franchise. They tried to buy a team but were rejected. They tried to get an expansion team started but the NFL wasn't having it. This is like one of those movies where the guy can't find work anywhere so he starts his own business, or no one will put him in a movie so he makes his own. You can see where I'm going with this. The two came together, along with some other investors in a similar situation, and formed this new competing football league called the AFL. Now, at first, no one respected them. They weren't seen as a real threat, because really, how do you compete with the NFL? They weren't the first to try something like this. Notably, there was the All-America Football Conference in the late 1940s. Going back even further, then football was gaining popularity after the war, and then they came in trying to capitalize on it. Nothing really came of it. Actually, oddly enough, there were previously 3 other competing leagues, all called the American Football League. Again, nothing came from any of them. So, given the dominance of the NFL over the past 40 years and how easy it was to defeat anyone who had ever challenged them, I don't think they felt much of a threat from the AFL. And I go back to the question, how do you possibly compete with the NFL? Seriously, what would a new league have to do to grab the attention of football fans away from the NFL? And here's what I came up with. Well, first and foremost, it needs to be accessible, meaning the fans need to be able to see the games, either live in their own city or ideally nationally televised. Also, you're gonna need some good players, right? That may be the most obvious one, and I'd say almost essential. The fans want to see some high quality football, and if all your players are worse than the ones in the NFL, how can you ever gain any respect? Finally, it'd be a good idea to separate the game itself. Maybe throw in a few rule changes, improvements if possible, throw in some gimmicks. Don't try to beat them at their own game, but instead make a few key changes and effectively create your own game. Can we agree that if the AFL were to make the games more accessible, attract some good players, and offer a slightly different but still good version of football, that would be a good way to compete? Because they did all of it. As far as making the games accessible, it wasn't easy, but for their first season, they were able to establish teams in 8 major cities across the country, 4 in the East and 4 in the West. They actually came close to having a Minnesota team, but then the NFL was able to steal it away from them by offering the owner a new NFL franchise that became known as the Minnesota Vikings. For national exposure, just before the start of their first season, they landed a much-needed 5-year, $2 million contract with ABC, giving them exclusive rights to air their games. It amazingly brought these AFL games right into everyone's home, while giving them an infusion of money that they could use to further promote and improve the league. By the time this deal expired in 1965, they had already signed a new contract, this one with NBC, for the rights to air the games on their network for the next 5 years. This one was worth $36 million, reflecting how much they had grown in the first half of the 1960s, and it secured that their games would be accessible for the entire nation straight through to the 1970s. For the players, admittedly, at first, it it was a little tough. There were a lot of rosters to fill, and they didn't provide much reason for players to choose them over the NFL. As a result, it ended up being mostly NFL rejects. I'm talking about former professional players that were getting too old, combined with younger players that simply weren't good enough. But they had a few big breaks. Remember Bud Adams, who was big in starting the league? Well, he was now in charge of the Houston Oilers. His team signed a player by the name of George Blanda. He was one of these former NFL players that had essentially been rejected by the league. The Oilers picked him to play as their quarterback and kicker in the AFL's first season. In addition, they were also able to draft the reigning Heisman Trophy winner Billy Cannon. The two of them led the Oilers to win the first 2 AFL championships. A few key pickups like this were essential early on, either recognizing talent that the NFL failed to see or simply offering more money to try to wrestle players away from the other league. I think anyone would agree that the greatest player that the AFL ever attracted was Joe Namath. In 1965, the AFL team, the New York Jets, drafted him as first pick to play quarterback for their team. If there's any basketball fans watching this, I equate this to Dr. J playing for the ABA. The Jets were able to attract him by offering a $427,000 contract, far more than the NFL was offering. Joe Namath was a great player, a big personality, and just about the perfect person to draw attention and respect to the AFL. And this sort of helped break the barrier too. It didn't take long before the AFL was drawing away other good players from the NFL. I mean, if they're good enough for Joe Namath. Plus, by this time, they had some solid sources of revenue through those TV contracts and stadium attendance, so they were able to offer more competitive contracts. Finally, the rules. They made a few alterations to separate themselves from the NFL. Possibly the biggest difference in gameplay was an emphasis on passing rather than running. I believe passing tends to lead to more scoring and just more exciting games in general. Since the AFL was forced to compete based on entertainment rather than talent, especially early on, this helped identify the league. Quite possibly the most relevant difference was the 2-point conversion. If you're not familiar, it's an option to run or pass the ball into the end zone after a touchdown to get 2 points instead of the traditional 1 point you get for kicking that field goal. It's become an important part of the NFL, and they didn't implement it until decades after the AFL was already doing it. Now, I didn't say the AFL invented it, but they were using it when the NFL wasn't, and that made them different. Also, what I view as an improvement, putting the players' names on the back of their jersey. It seems like common sense today, but that's just another thing that the AFL was doing that the NFL wasn't. When you combine all of this, by 1966, the AFL had grown into a real threat for the NFL. As a result, both leagues thought it would be in their best interest to simply join together. In June of that year, they announced a merger between the two leagues. It took a while for them to completely come together, they kept separate schedules, but starting the upcoming season, they agreed to hold a single draft and to have a championship game. The game would place the winner of the AFL against the winner of the NFL. It wasn't called it at the time, but today we consider that 1967 championship game to be the first Super Bowl. And you know how the AFL was in a constant struggle to gain respect as their own legitimate league? I mean, the merger obviously shows a degree of credibility, but even then, they were still perceived as being a step below the NFL. Well, I think they finally closed that gap in everyone's minds during Super Bowl III. The first 2 Super Bowls were won by the NFL team, the Green Bay Packers, but the third one was won by the AFL team, the New York Jets. If you remember, led by Joe Namath, so that contract turned out to be even more important than anyone could have ever imagined. In 1970, the two leagues came together entirely. The AFL was now up to 10 teams, whereas the NFL had 16 of them. To even things out, the Steelers, Browns, and Colts switched over to the AFL side, giving them each 13 teams. They then started calling the 13 AFL teams the AFC, or American Football Conference, and the remaining 13 teams on the NFL side were called the NFC, or National Football Conference. And the entire league obviously kept the name the NFL, so that's how we get a combined league called NFL with 2 competing conferences called the AFC and the NFC. That was a lot of letters. The new league came out of this whole thing bigger and stronger than ever. It's an impressive story. The whole thing takes place in about a decade's time, and look how much they were able to accomplish. They went from non-existing to becoming the biggest threat that the NFL has ever seen. I mean, we still see their effects in the league today. The obvious one being the league structure and all the teams created through it that we continue to watch all the time, but also consider the more exciting style of play, incorporating more passes. Maybe something could be said about the 2-point conversion. And what about putting the names of the players on their jerseys? The year the NFL started doing that was 1970, right after the full merger, so I think it's safe to say that's a direct result of the AFL. Oh yeah, and you know, the Super Bowl, the biggest and most viewed US sporting event every single year, that wouldn't be what it is today without the AFL. It's a funny thing, in trying to compete with the NFL, the AFL actually ended up making them much bigger and helped shape them into what they are today. Let me know in the comments, what are your thoughts about the AFL? Was it a positive or negative to the NFL? Honestly, it all seems pretty positive to me. Things might have gotten a little crazy in the world of football for that decade, but looking at the lasting effect today, it's all pretty good. More teams and more markets, names on jerseys, the Super Bowl, what's to dislike about any of that? Also, I'm curious, do you think something like this could ever happen again? The NFL was popular going into all of it, but nothing like they are today. We've had the XFL and arena football and some others all try to make their mark, but do they really have a chance at making a difference in the same way that the AFL did? I say it'd be unlikely, but hey, that's what people were saying about the AFL at the time, so who knows? So any thoughts you have about any of it, leave it in the comments. I'd like to hear what you have to say. Today's sponsor is Audible, and you know, I was searching through their titles a little bit ago, and I came across this audiobook labeled Random Fun Facts and Motivational Quotes. I mean, how do you pass that up? It turned out to be a nice, relaxing audiobook, so I thought I'd tell you about it. Plus, we can all use a little motivation. Sometimes I hear one of those quotes and it really does stick with me for a while. You can get this for free on Audible. Members get a credit good for any audiobook regardless of price. Or if you're not into that particular audiobook, they do happen to have the largest selection on the planet. Bestsellers, thrillers, memoirs. I recommend you take a look for yourself and just see what you can find. That's how I tend to find mine. All you have to do is go to audible.com/companyman or text companyman to 500-500. That's to get one audiobook and 2 Audible originals absolutely free. Thank you for watching.